What drove Robert Long to subject 16 children to physical and emotional abuse, and what can be done to prevent similar cases in the future? In the quiet hills of Pike County, Ohio, a sprawling farmhouse sat under the cover of pine trees, its peeling porch and rusted gutters masking a horror that would soon explode into headlines. On June 21, 2023, sheriff's deputies, Child Protective Services agents, and a team of forensic investigators stormed the property and rescued 16 kids, ages 2 to 17, who had been living in conditions no child should ever know. Their story is a chilling reminder that danger can hide behind the most ordinary of doors, and that our systems for protecting the vulnerable are sometimes blind to the darkest corners. Robert Long, 48, appeared to neighbors as a devout minister, a homeschooling enthusiast, and a man who loved the great outdoors. He owned the 12-acre farm, ran a small learning center in the barn, and ran a handful of community workshops on spiritual parenting. The children, some of whom were relatives of Long's, others taken in from foster care, were never seen at school, never taken to doctors, and rarely, if ever, outside the property's barbed fence. Their parents, or legal guardians, were either dead, absent, or had signed over custody under vague, pressure-filled agreements. To understand how this nightmare took root, we have to travel back to the early 2000s, when Ohio's homeschooling laws were first loosened. In 1999, the state passed a law that allowed parents to educate their kids at home without any mandatory reporting, oversight, or curriculum standards, provided they could show reasonable evidence of instruction. The intention was to give families freedom, but the wording left a massive loophole. By 2005, Ohio had the highest percentage of homeschooled students in the nation, yet a 2015 audit revealed that fewer than 2% of those families ever submitted any paperwork. Psychologists say that isolation is a classic tool of control. Dr. Maya Patel, a specialist in cult dynamics, explains that, when you cut off external validation, you become the sole source of reality for the individual. Long's self-styled ministerial authority, and his claim of being a homeschooling expert were just the veneer. Inside the farmhouse, the children were forced to work 10-hour days, hauling firewood, cleaning animal pens, and repairing fences, all while being denied basic hygiene. Meals consisted of boiled potatoes and stale bread, sometimes stretched over days. Water came from a well that hadn't been tested in years, and a single bathroom served the whole household. The evidence gathered by investigators paints a picture of systematic cruelty. Police reports list 27 counts of child endangerment, 15 counts of aggravated assault, and 12 counts of neglect. The house contained 12 bunk beds stacked in a single room, each with a thin mattress and a blanket that was more thread than fabric. One child, now 15, told investigators that they were not allowed to speak unless spoken to, and that any crying triggered the loud voice that would beat them with a wooden plank. Medical examinations found untreated ear infections, severe malnutrition, and signs of repeated blunt force trauma on the ribs of 3 children. Yet the most unsettling piece of documentation is a handwritten curriculum that Long kept on his desk. It reads like a gospel: Day 1, prayer. Day 2, work. Day 3, obedience. Day 4, discipline. Interspersed are notes like, punishment for questioning, 30 push UPS, and, reward for silence, extra rations. The Learning Center was a dilapidated shed where Long delivered sermons in a whisper, his voice echoing off the cracked plaster, while a child's crayon drawings, sunny landscapes of a family, were torn down as unholy distractions. Just when we think we've mapped the terrain, a twist emerges. In March 2022, a neighboring farmer, Tom Hayes, filed a complaint after his tractor's cattle guard was damaged by an unexplained force. He later realized the fence line that protected Long's property had been subtly shifted, creating a hidden corridor that led directly to a concealed basement. Inside that basement, investigators found a second set of living quarters, an even darker layer. There were restraints, a set of handcuffed doors, and a wall covered in newspaper clippings about cult police infiltration and the Manson family. Most chillingly, a journal belonging to Long's sister, Ellen May, detailed a purification project, begun in 2018, where the children will be reborn through fire. The big reveal isn't just the physical abuse, it's the psychological architecture that Long built. He didn't merely neglect the kids, he rewired their perception of reality. Using a mixture of spiritual rhetoric, disciplined routine, and fear-based punishment, he turned a farmhouse into a microcult. Experts compare his methods to those of notorious, psychological tyrants like Charles Manson and David Koresh, where the leader's charisma and the group's isolation create a closed feedback loop. In Long's case, the loop was reinforced by the state's hands-off homeschooling policy, which gave him legal cover to claim religious freedom while committing atrocities. Some observers propose alternative explanations. One theory suggests that Long was simply a deranged individual whose personal trauma manifested as abusive control, with no larger, cult intent. Another argues that the children's distress stemmed from a failed attempt at alternative education, a well-meaning, albeit misguided, experiment that spiraled out of control due to lack of resources and proper training. A third view holds that the whole operation was part of a larger, organized network of illegal, homeschooling rings, trafficking children for labor and exploitation, and that Long was just a node in a bigger, more sinister supply chain. Each of these lenses captures a fragment of truth, but none fully explains the systematic, doctrinal veneer that permeated every action on that farm. The reality sits at the intersection of personal pathology, religious rationalization, and regulatory failure. What does that mean for us? First, Ohio must tighten its homeschooling oversight, requiring annual inspections, curriculum submissions, and child welfare checks. Second, law enforcement agencies need better training to spot the subtle signs of educational isolation, like the absence of school records, missing vaccinations, and unregistered medical visits. Third, communities must cultivate watchdog relationships, where neighbors feel empowered to ask uncomfortable questions without fear of retaliation. My gut says the most dangerous element isn't the abuse itself, but the belief that religious or educational freedom can be weaponized without accountability. Long exploited a loophole, wrapped his cruelty in scripture, and hid behind the word homeschooling. By giving him a platform to control every aspect of the children's lives, spiritual, academic, physical, he erased their ability to seek help. The only way to stop similar tragedies is to demand transparency wherever a child's education occurs, whether it's a public school, a private academy, or a farmhouse in the woods. So, as we close this chapter, one question still lingers: if a child's teachers can be anyone who claims a diploma, who will be the next protector when that diploma turns into a weapon? Let me know what you think. Could stricter regulations have saved these kids, or would it have merely pushed the abuse further underground? Drop your thoughts in the comments, and we'll keep digging. The twist, however, arrived not in the courtroom but in a stack of old tax returns tucked away beneath a cracked laminate desk in the county clerk's office. When investigators finally obtained them, after a reluctant judge granted a subpoena, they discovered that Father McAllister, the self-styled pastor-teacher, had been receiving quarterly payments from a shadowy non-profit that, on paper, promoted cultural preservation. The non-profit's board listed 3 names that matched the last names of several of the children's grandparents, all of whom had vanished from public records years earlier. It turned out that the organization was a front for a covert network of extremist, family sovereignty groups, who believed that state interference was an existential threat to their way of life. In a startlingly crisp email exchange found among the receipts, a distant relative wrote, "We are pleased to see the children thriving under true parental guidance. Let the state keep its hands off." The big reveal was that the horrific abuse was not an isolated act of a lone madman, but a calculated tactic within a broader ideology that weaponizes privacy as a shield. This reframes the narrative from one villainous homeschooler to an organized movement that manipulates legal loopholes to protect its members from scrutiny. It also explains why earlier complaints from neighbors, who noticed the children's bruised arms and the family's erratic schedule, were dismissed as cultural differences, rather than flagged as red flags. The apparent absence of any prior reports was less about bureaucratic failure and more about a concerted effort to keep the family's affairs invisible. Alternative explanations abound. Some argue that the tax receipts were a benign charitable donation, unrelated to the abuse, a misinterpretation of financial paperwork by overzealous investigators. Others suggest that the extremist network was a phantom, a post hoc construction designed to shift blame from personal pathology onto a larger, more sensational conspiracy. Yet, forensic accountants traced a direct line from the nonprofit's funds to a vendor that supplied the family's isolated property with reinforced steel doors, soundproofing material, and a custom-built security system, items that were never listed on any home improvement permit. The financial trail, combined with the physical alterations to the farmhouse, undermines the coincidence hypothesis. Finally, the case forces us to confront a darker truth. When we champion absolute parental rights without robust oversight, we risk creating a legal blind spot that can be exploited by those who see children as property rather than individuals. The solution cannot simply be more paperwork, it must be a cultural shift that redefines the balance between liberty and protection. We need a national framework that treats any educational setting, public, private, or home, as a child safety ecosystem subject to baseline standards, while still honoring genuine religious freedoms. In closing, we must ask ourselves, if the very mechanisms designed to safeguard freedom can be twisted into instruments of oppression, how do we rebuild trust in a system that must both respect autonomy and protect the vulnerable? The answer may lie in community vigilance, transparent reporting, and a willingness to interrogate the shadows where ideology meets isolation. What would you, as a citizen, do when the line between faith-based education and dangerous secrecy blurs?